The number is $250,000, not $1 million, not $500,000, $250,000. And here is what makes that number strange. Statistically, once you cross it, your wealth tends to keep growing almost regardless of what you do. Below it, even when you do everything right, max your 401k, avoid debt, live below your means, invest consistently, your net worth barely moves. 2 steps forward, 1.5 steps back, month after month, year after year. The math should not work that way, but it does. And the reason why is one of the most carefully under-discussed mechanisms in modern personal finance. The Federal Reserve's 2023 survey of consumer finances found that the median American household has a net worth of $192,700. The average, pulled upward by the ultra-wealthy, sits at $1,059,470. That gap between median and average is not a statistical curiosity. It is the entire story. It tells you that most households are stuck somewhere below the threshold where wealth begins compounding at a rate that actually changes your life, while a smaller group has crossed into a zone where money generates money, faster than time erodes it. The threshold between those two worlds, based on both the Fed data and independent modeling by researchers at the National Bureau of Economic Research, lands almost precisely at $250,000 in liquid or semi-liquid investable assets, not home equity, not your car, actual deployed capital, and only 14.3% of American households under the age of 45 have crossed it. To understand why that number is so hard to reach, you have to go back about 50 years and trace the structural decisions that made it this way. In 1971, the United States severed the dollar's connection to gold, and the global financial system shifted from a commodity-anchored model to a debt-based fiat architecture. That single decision set off a chain of consequences that most people alive today have never had explained to them. When money is no longer tied to a finite resource, credit becomes the primary engine of economic growth. Banks, incentivized to lend, expanded consumer credit access throughout the 1980s and 1990s. Credit cards, auto loans, adjustable rate mortgages, the entire consumer debt ecosystem exploded. Between 1980 and 2000, total household debt in the United States grew from roughly $1.4 trillion to over $7 trillion. The system was not broken. It was working exactly as designed. But what it was designed to do was keep consumption high, not build household wealth. Then came the asset inflation engine. When the Federal Reserve began using interest rate policy as its primary lever for economic stabilization, especially after the 2008 financial crisis, it created a structural tailwind for anyone who already owned assets. Low rates made borrowing cheap, which drove up the prices of stocks and real estate. Between 2009 and 2021, the S&P 500 returned approximately 630%. The median home price nearly doubled. If you already owned assets in 2009, the decade that followed made you dramatically wealthier with almost no additional effort. If you were a young worker in 2009, trying to pay down student loans, save a down payment, build an emergency fund, you were running a race where the finish line was moving away from you at the same speed you were running toward it. By the time pandemic-era fiscal stimulus hit in 2020 and 2021, the pattern had calcified. Asset owners gained, asset seekers got higher prices, and inflation arriving in 2022 delivered a final blow to the savings of households who were still trying to accumulate enough capital to begin compounding. Real wage growth went negative for most of 2022. Savings rates, which had briefly spiked during lockdowns, collapsed back toward historic lows. The runway between earning money and deploying it productively got shorter, while the entrance fee to the compounding world got higher. Meet Jordan. Jordan is 34 years old, lives in Austin, Texas, works as a project manager for a mid-sized technology company, and earns $94,000 a year before taxes. Jordan is not careless with money. Jordan has a credit score of 741, contributes 8% of their salary to a 401k with a 3% employer match, carries no credit card debt, drives a used car with 38 months left on a 4.9% loan, and rents an apartment for $1,780 a month. By most cultural standards, Jordan is doing the right things. By most financial content standards, Jordan is the success story. Jordan's take-home pay after federal and state taxes is approximately $5,900 per month. Rent takes $1,580. The car payment takes $420. Groceries, utilities, phone, and subscriptions run about $900. Health insurance through the employer costs $310 per month after company contribution. That leaves Jordan with roughly $2,490 per month for everything else: dining, social life, clothing, emergency fund contributions, and any additional investing beyond the 401k. Jordan is disciplined. Jordan puts $600 a month into a brokerage account and $200 into a high-yield savings account. After reasonable living expenses, Jordan has essentially maximized what the budget allows. Jordan's current investable net worth, meaning the 401k, balance plus the brokerage account, is $47,000. At $800 per month in new contributions and an assumed 8% average annual return, Jordan will reach $250,000 in approximately 13 years. Jordan will be 47. And that is assuming no major setbacks, no medical emergency, no job loss, no economic downturn that forces a withdrawal, no child, no aging parent, no market correction that cuts the portfolio in half during year 9 and requires 5 additional years of recovery. The math is not cruel by accident. It is cruel by design, because below $250,000, your contributions do more of the work than your returns. Above $250,000, your returns start doing more of the work than your contributions. That inflection point, the moment the machine starts feeding itself, is the death zone, and Jordan is stuck on the wrong side of it for over a decade. Here is where most financial advice gets it exactly wrong, and why the standard prescription fails people in Jordan's position. The advice is almost always the same: spend less, earn more, and invest the difference. Cut the subscriptions, skip the vacation, get a side hustle, bring your lunch to work. And if Jordan does all of that, squeezes another $400 per month through genuine sacrifice, the timeline to $250,000 drops from 13 years to roughly 9.5. 4 years saved. Still arriving at 43 or 44. Still spending a full decade plus in the death zone. The reason that advice fails is not because it is wrong. It is because it is optimizing the wrong variable. Below $250,000, the binding constraint is not savings. Rate. The binding constraint is time, and the only way to compress time is not to save faster, but to redeploy capital smarter. Specifically, to shift from low-yield saving behavior to equity-heavy deployment behavior as early as possible, and to stop treating the 401k as the primary vehicle when tax-advantaged investing limits artificially cap what disciplined savers like Jordan can deploy into the market. The 401k contribution limit in 2024 is $23,000. Jordan is contributing $7,520. But even maxing out at $23,000 per year would only accelerate the timeline to around 9 years. The fundamental math of compounding below $250,000 is still working against Jordan because the asset base is too small for returns to dominate contributions. The most counterintuitive truth in this entire analysis is that the people who escape the death zone fastest are often not the people who save the most aggressively. They are the people who take asymmetric bets with a portion of their capital, single stocks, real estate with leverage, early-stage equity, while maintaining core index fund positions. Not because those bets always win, because the only mathematical path to compressing 13 years into 5 is to introduce non-linear, Return potential into the portfolio before the portfolio is large enough to grow linearly out of the death zone on its own. This is uncomfortable advice because it increases variance. But variance is exactly what someone in the death zone needs, because the alternative is a guaranteed decade of marginal progress. You are not struggling to cross $250,000 because you are undisciplined. You are not failing because you lack financial literacy. You are navigating a system that was structurally reconfigured over 5 decades to benefit those who already hold assets at the expense of those still trying to acquire them. The academic evidence on this is not subtle. A 2021 paper published in the Journal of Political Economy by economists at the University of Chicago found that wealth inequality in the United States is primarily driven not by income differences, but by return differences, meaning wealthier households earn higher returns on their assets, compounding their advantage in ways that income growth alone cannot offset. The Federal Reserve's own distributional financial accounts data shows that the top 1% of households own 30.6% of all corporate equities and mutual fund shares. The bottom 50% own 0.6%. This is not a motivation problem, it is an access and timing problem built into the architecture of the system. Here is what actually changes outcomes for people in the death zone, and the steps are specific enough to act on this week. The first move is to calculate your personal death zone exit date. Open a compound interest calculator. The one at investor.gov works fine, and input your current investable assets, your monthly contribution, and an 8% average annual return. Find the year you cross $250,000. Write that number down. Make it real. Most people in Jordan's position have never done this calculation because they are afraid of the answer. The answer is uncomfortable, but it is also actionable. If you do not know your exit date, you cannot compress it. The second move is to audit your tax drag. Most people in the death zone are paying unnecessary taxes on investment returns because they are holding assets in taxable accounts when they have not yet maximized every available tax-advantaged vehicle. If you have not maxed your HSA, which in 2024 allows $4,150 for individuals and $8,300 for families, you are paying taxes on investment returns you could be growing tax-free with triple tax advantages. The HSA is the single most underused wealth acceleration tool available to American earners in Jordan's income band, and redirecting even $200 per month from a taxable brokerage into an HSA invested in index funds meaningfully compresses the timeline by reducing drag. The third move is to introduce one asymmetric position into your portfolio, capped at 10% of your investable assets, in something with non-linear upside potential. This is not a recommendation to buy speculative assets recklessly. It is a mathematical argument. Below $250,000, linear returns are structurally insufficient to escape the death zone in a timeline that aligns with your prime earning and compounding years. A single position in a high-growth individual stock, a REIT with leverage, or a fractional real estate platform like Fundrise or Realty Mogul gives you exposure to return patterns that can non-linearly accelerate your trajectory. If it fails, you absorb the loss and rebalance. If it succeeds, it may compress your timeline by 3 to 5 years. The asymmetry is worth it specifically because the downside is bounded and the upside is not. The fourth and final move is to raise your income before you raise your savings rate. This sounds obvious, but the mechanism matters. Research from economist Raj Chetty at Harvard's Opportunity Insights project shows that income jumps, not gradual raises, are the primary predictor of early wealth accumulation among households that eventually cross into the top wealth quartile. A 20% income increase through a job change, a negotiated raise, or the addition of a second income stream deployed entirely into investments, at Jordan's income level, adds approximately $940 per month of investable capital. That single change compresses the death zone timeline from 13 years to under 8. Nothing in the savings rate column comes close to producing that result. The $250,000 threshold is not arbitrary. It is the point where the machine changes. Modes. Below it, you are feeding the machine. Above it, the machine feeds you. The gap between those two states is not a moral failing. It is a structural reality built across 5 decades of policy decisions that systematically advantaged asset holders over asset seekers. Understanding that is not an excuse to stop working. It is a reason to work smarter, to stop playing. The savings rate game, when the timeline game, is what actually determines when your financial life begins to feel different. Jordan will get there. You will get there. But the path is not the one that gets described in most personal finance content, because that content was built for an era when the system was different. The era changed. The advice has to change with it. The death zone has an exit. You just have to know exactly where the door is.